My daughter sent me an email disinviting me from her wedding in Paris, the same wedding I was paying $250,000 for. She joked that I could watch from home on Google Earth. LOL. I simply replied, "Enjoy your big day." By the next morning, her Parisian dream was in ruins and she couldn't stop blowing up my phone. But before I get into how I turned their perfect wedding into a lesson they would never forget, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. The email arrived with a soft ping, a sound that cut through the quiet hum of my workshop. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Cleveland, the sky outside a flat Ohio gray. For a retired electrical engineer like me, the workshop was a sanctuary, a place of order. On the walls, tools hung in their designated spots, cleaned and oiled. Schematics for old projects were rolled neatly in tubes. It was a room where logic prevailed, where every problem had a solution if you just looked at the system correctly. For the last 3 years since my wife Susan passed, this room had been the one place that still made sense. I set down the miniature gearbox I was working on and rolled my chair to the computer. I saw her name Chloe and my heart did a familiar, foolish little leap. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the call, the email where she'd say she missed me. I clicked it open. The words scrolled onto the screen, each one a small, polished stone dropped into the quiet machinery of my afternoon. "Hi, Dad," it began, and the casual warmth was the first lie. "Great news, Ben and I have finalized the venue in Paris. It's a literal chateau. We're so excited." Paris. The word stopped my breath for a second. It wasn't just a city. It was a promise. A promise I'd whispered to Susan over hospital bed railings. A promise of a 40th anniversary trip we both knew she'd never get to take. Chloe knew that. She had been there holding her mother's other hand when I made it. I pushed the memory down and kept reading. "Just wanted to let you know that we've decided to keep the ceremony very small, just our closest friends for the vibe, you know. It's going to be a huge content opportunity for my brand." My brand. My 28-year-old daughter, who I had taught to ride a bike and helped with her calculus homework, now spoke of her life in terms of content and brands. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised. But the next line was the one that changed everything. "Don't worry if you want to be a part of it, you can watch through the Google Earth window, LOL. We'll send you the coordinates." The LOL was the cruelest part. A tiny 3-letter dismissal of my entire existence. A joke made at the expense of a father who was supposed to be a continent away, quietly accepting his irrelevance. And then the final twist of the knife. "Thanks again for making this possible." Making it possible. I leaned back, the chair creaking in the silence. I remembered the meeting 3 months ago. Chloe and her fiancé Ben, a young man with a sharp suit and an even sharper smile, had spread a glossy pitch deck across my dining room table. It was all buzzwords. Synergy. Disruption. A new app that was going to change something. They didn't need a business loan, they explained. They needed a strategic family investment to launch their company, and what better launchpad than a high-profile influencer-studded wedding in Paris? It was a ridiculous idea. A house of cards built on hashtags. But I saw the light in Chloe's eyes, the same light she'd had as a little girl, talking about wanting a pony. And I thought of Susan, who would have wanted her daughter to have the world. So I agreed. I gave them $250,000 from my retirement fund. To make it happen, I had sold my 1967 Mustang, the car I had spent 10 years restoring, the car Susan and I had taken on drives down to the lake on summer evenings. I sold a piece of my history, a piece of her, so that Chloe could have her content opportunity. And now I was being invited to watch it on a screen. Like a stranger. Like a fan. I stared at the email, at the casual, brutal letters. There was no anger. The shock was too cold for that. It was the feeling an engineer gets when he looks at a perfect schematic and finds a single fatal flaw. A crack in the foundation. The entire structure was compromised. All the years of love, of sacrifice, of putting her first, It was all built on a flawed design. The design assumed my love was unconditional, that my support was a utility she could tap into whenever she wanted, without consequence. She was wrong. An unconditional system is an unstable system. It was time to introduce a feedback loop. My hands moved over the keyboard. I thought of all the things I could write. The angry, wounded letter of a betrayed father. The pleading message of a lonely old man. I wrote none of it. In this new, cold, logical space, those emotional responses were inefficient. They were noise in the signal. I typed 2 sentences. Clean, simple, unambiguous. Sure. Enjoy your big day. I hit send. I closed the laptop, the reflection in the dark screen showing a man I hadn't seen in years. Not a grieving father, not a generous benefactor, but an engineer who had just identified a critical system failure, and who knew with absolute certainty how to fix it. The morning after the email, I woke at 5 a.m. Grief has a schedule, but on this morning, efficiency had taken the earlier appointment. There was no lingering sadness, no hollow ache in my chest. There was only a quiet, humming clarity. Instead of heading to my workshop, I went to the small desk in the corner of my living room. I made coffee black and strong the way I like it, when I need my thoughts to be sharp. Then I opened my old leather briefcase. Inside wasn't a mess of receipts and forgotten papers. It was a single, thick folder. The contents were organized with the precision of an engineer's blueprint, because that's what they were, the blueprint for my daughter's future, a future I was now redesigning. I lifted the main document. The paper was heavy, the kind lawyers use when they want the words to have physical weight. It was the investment agreement drafted 3 months ago by my old friend David Chen. David had been my lawyer for 30 years, a man who saw loopholes the way I saw faulty wiring. "You're too generous, Frank," he'd told me in his office, tapping the final draft. "Generosity needs a firewall." He had built me a fortress and called it a contract. Chloe and Ben had been so blinded by the $250,000 figure on the first page that they'd skimmed the rest. I, however, had memorized it. I didn't need to read it again, but I did, tracing the lines with my finger, as if to reacquaint myself with my own defenses. The money was not a gift. That was the first and most important distinction. It was an investment legally structured into their newly formed company, Eclat Ventures, LLC. The purpose of the investment was singular and explicitly stated the execution of the Chloe Miller and Ben Carter wedding event in Paris. The funds weren't in their bank account. They were held in a third-party escrow account, a financial waiting room. The disbursement schedule was meticulous. Phase 1 for the venue deposit. Phase 2 for vendor retainers. Phase 3 for final payments. And each phase, every single dollar required my written authorization to be released. My signature was the key to the entire kingdom. And then there was David's masterpiece, Clause 12b, the load-bearing wall of the entire agreement. I had read it a dozen times, but this morning it sounded like poetry. The primary investor. It read, "Frank Miller shall be treated as a guest of honor at all functions, celebrations, and events related to this investment. This includes, but is not limited to, a formal invitation, premium seating, and respectful inclusion. Any action, communication, or omission that deliberately excludes or disrespects the primary investor shall be considered a material breach of this agreement. Upon such a breach, the primary investor reserves the full right to pause all further disbursements from the escrow account, pending a formal review." I closed my eyes and pictured Chloe's email. Watch through the Google Earth window, LOL. A material breach. It was so clean, so undeniable. They hadn't just hurt my feelings. They had violated the contract. They had handed me the keys to their own cage. The phone rang at 7:15 a.m. I glanced at the caller ID, a long string of numbers, a country code I recognized. France. I let it ring twice, took a sip of coffee, and answered. Monsieur Miller. The voice was a woman's professional, but stretched thin with a panic she was trying to keep contained. The expensive, well-mannered kind of panic. This is Frank Miller, I said calmly. This is Geneviève Dubois from Eclat Events. We are the wedding planners for your daughter. Of course, Geneviève. Is everything all right? There was a hesitant pause. I am not sure, monsieur. The wire transfer for the Château de Villette, the final deposit, it has been rejected. The bank is saying the originating account has placed a hold on the funds. I let a few seconds of silence pass, just enough to make my next words sound thoughtful rather than rehearsed. Oh, that's certainly not right, I said, injecting a note of mild confusion into my voice. It must be a clerical error on the bank's end. International transfers can be so finicky. Thank you for letting me know. I will call them immediately and sort this out. Merci, monsieur, she said, the relief in her voice palpable. The chateau director was becoming concerned. Don't you worry about a thing, Geneviève. I'll handle it, I said. I hung up. My pulse was as steady as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My hand didn't shake as I placed the phone back on the desk. Last night, after sending my reply to Chloe, I had made one simple call to the escrow service. Citing a potential discrepancy I needed to review, I had requested a temporary 24-hour administrative hold on all outgoing transactions. It was the first move in a game they didn't know they were playing. They thought they were in Paris planning a party. They had no idea they were in my workshop, and I was about to recalibrate the entire machine. The phone sat on the desk for less than a minute before it rang again. This time the caller ID was all too familiar. Chloe. I picked up on the first ring. Hello, Chloe, I said, my voice perfectly level. Dad. What did you do? Her voice wasn't a question. It was an accusation, high-pitched and frayed with the first real panic I had heard from her in a decade. Geneviève just called me. She said the payment for the chateau was rejected. You need to fix this right now. I took another slow sip of my coffee. The curtain was up. The second act had begun. And for the first time in a very long time, I was the one holding the script. I sat at my desk, the heavy paper of the contract cool and solid beneath my fingers. This was not just a document. It was a machine designed with the same precision I once used to design a power grid. Every clause was a wire, every signature line a switch. And I was the one with his hand on the master breaker. My old friend and lawyer David Chen had been insistent. Frank, he'd said, his pen tapping a rhythm on the oak of his desk, "You're a good man." And good men assume the best in people they love. That's a beautiful quality in a father, but it's a liability in an investor. Generosity needs a firewall. He had built me a fortress. I hadn't given Chloe and Ben a gift of $250,000. I had made a structured investment into their company, a flimsy LLC they'd named Eclat Ventures. The money itself wasn't even in their control. It sat in a third-party escrow account, a kind of financial waiting room, where funds waited for specific instructions. My instructions. The agreement was crystal clear. The money was to be dispersed in 3 phases, each one tied to a specific milestone for the wedding. Phase 1, the deposit for the chateau. Phase 2, retainers for the caterer, the florist, the photographer. Phase 3, the final balance payments due the week of the event. And each transfer from the first dollar to the last required my explicit written approval. My signature was the key that turned the lock. They had been so focused on the big number, so mesmerized by the idea of a $250,000 windfall, that they'd barely glanced at the architecture of the deal. They saw a bank account. I, with David's guidance, had built a system of checks and balances. My fingers found the page for Clause 12. There, under the dry heading of covenants and conditions, was David's masterpiece. Clause 12b, the load-bearing wall of the entire agreement. I read the words, and a cold, calm certainty settled over me. The primary investor, Frank Miller, shall be treated as a guest of honor at all functions, celebrations, and events related to this investment. This includes, but is not limited to, a formal invitation, premium seating, and respectful inclusion. Any action, communication, or omission that deliberately excludes or disrespects the primary investor shall be considered a material breach of this agreement. Upon such a breach, the primary investor reserves the full right to pause all further disbursements from the escrow account pending a formal review. Respectful inclusion. I let the phrase sit in my mind. Then I pictured the words from my daughter's email sent less than 24 hours ago. If you want to be a part of it, you can watch through the Google Earth window, LOL. It was so clean, so perfect. They hadn't just been cruel. They had been careless. They had violated the very clause designed to ensure they remembered whose sacrifice was funding their fantasy. They had breached the contract. And in doing so, they hadn't just closed a door on their father. They had handed him all the keys. The grandfather clock in the hall had just chimed 7 when the phone on my desk began to vibrate. I didn't look at it right away. I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched a single fat snowflake drift past the workshop window. The caller ID was a long string of digits, starting with a country code I recognized. +33. France. I let it ring a second time, a small courtesy to my own composure, then picked up. "Frank Miller," I said. "Monsieur Miller." The voice was a woman's, laced with an accent as crisp as a fresh croissant, but the edges were frayed with a well-mannered panic. "This is Geneviève Dubois from Eclat Events. We are the wedding planners for your daughter in Paris." "Of course, Geneviève. It's a pleasure to speak with you. Is everything all right?" I kept my tone warm open, the sound of a man expecting good news. There was a half-second of hesitation on her end, the kind that tells you the news is anything but good. "I am not sure, monsieur. I hope this is just a small misunderstanding. The wire transfer for the Château de Villette, the final deposit, it has been rejected." I let a beat of silence pass, as if processing the information. "Rejected?" I asked, allowing a note of mild fatherly confusion to enter my voice. "That can't be right. The funds are certainly there. The bank noted the originating account has placed a hold on all disbursements," she explained, her voice tight with the stress of managing a multi-million-dollar venue director. "They said it was an administrative review. The chateau director is becoming very concerned, monsieur. The payment is now overdue." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the contract on my desk. At Clause 12b. "Geneviève, I do apologize," I said, my voice smooth as oil. "It must be a clerical error on the bank's end. These international transfers with the time difference, they can be so finicky. Thank you for your diligence in letting me know. I will call them immediately and get this sorted out." "Oh, merci, monsieur," she said, and the relief that flooded her voice was almost comical. "Thank you so much. I knew it must be a mistake." "Don't you worry about a thing, Geneviève. I'll handle it," I said. "You just focus on making my daughter's day beautiful." It was a simple, beautiful lie, and it worked perfectly. I hung up the phone. My pulse was a steady 72 beats per minute. My hand was as still as the sleeping tools on the wall. I had made one call last night, a simple request for a temporary administrative hold. It was the first lever I had pulled in a machine of my own design. The phone sat on the desk for less than a minute, the silence in the workshop settling back into its comfortable rhythm. I had just picked up my coffee cup, the ceramic warm against my fingers, when the screen lit up again. This time there was no long string of international numbers, just a name I knew better than my own. Chloe. I picked up on the first ring. I didn't need to feign surprise for this call. This one was expected. This one was part of the design. "Hello, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Dad." "What did you do?" The voice that came through the speaker was not the breezy, confident tone of her email. It was a shriek, thin and sharp and stripped of all its polish. It was the voice of a person whose perfectly constructed world had just developed a crack right down the middle. Genevieve just called me. She was hysterical. She said the payment for the chateau was rejected. She said the bank put a hold on everything. This is a nightmare, Dad. You need to fix this right now. I listened, letting her frantic, entitled words wash over me. I heard the clatter of something in the background. Maybe a pen holder knocked over in a gesture of fury. I heard Ben's voice, a low, urgent murmur trying to calm her down. But her panic was too big for the room she was in. It spilled out across the Atlantic, a tidal wave of consequence she had summoned herself. She had wanted to treat me like a bank, an ATM with a face. And now for the first time the machine was telling her insufficient funds. Not in money, in respect. "Are you listening to me?" she yelled, her voice cracking. "This is my wedding. You are ruining my wedding." I took another slow sip of my coffee. I looked around my quiet workshop, at the tools that answered only to my hands, at the schematics that followed the laws of physics, not the whims of ego. Everything here was real. Everything on her end of the line was a fantasy I had paid for. And the bill had just come due. The curtain was up. The second act had begun. And for the first time in a very long time, I was the one holding the script. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the frantic, ragged edge of my daughter's voice coming from an ocean away. The sound didn't hurt me. It was just data. A system in overload. "Dad, what did you do?" she had shrieked. I took a sip of coffee before I answered, letting the warmth settle. "I'm not sure I understand, Chloe," I said, my voice the calm, steady hum of a well-grounded machine. "I received an alert from the escrow company about a potential security issue, so I placed a temporary hold just as a standard precaution. It's just due diligence. I was about to call them to sort it out." "Due diligence?" Her voice went up an octave. "Dad, this isn't a business deal. It's my wedding. My wedding is in 3 days. Do you have any idea what this looks like? Genevieve is panicking. The caterer just sent me a frantic text. The florist is asking if we're canceling. This is a 5-star event, not some backyard barbecue. My entire brand is tied to this. All of our friends are here. You're humiliating me." I pictured her in a chic Parisian apartment, probably pacing on a polished herringbone floor, one hand gesturing wildly, the other clutching a phone like a weapon. The image didn't stir any fatherly pity. I simply saw a series of poor choices reaching their logical conclusion. The fact that her first thought was about her brand, and not about, say, the reason her own father wasn't invited, told me everything I needed to know. The system was more broken than I thought. Humiliation is a temporary state, Chloe. A breach of contract is a bit more permanent. I said the words coming out even and measured. There was a sputtering on the other end of the line. "Breach of contract. You're the one breaching the contract by withholding the funds." The phone was suddenly snatched away. Ben's voice, slick and condescending, slid into my ear. "Frank," he said, and the use of my first name was meant to be a power play, a way to reduce me from a father to a difficult business associate. "Let's be very clear. You have a contractual obligation to fund this event. What you are doing is illegal. We have a legally binding agreement, and you are in direct violation of it. If you don't release those funds within the hour, our lawyer will be in touch with yours." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "I'm sure you don't want things to get messy." I almost smiled. He was trying to intimidate me with the very weapon I had designed. He was a child threatening a fortress with a pebble. "Messy is the last thing I want, Ben," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "In fact, I'm delighted that you want to talk about our legally binding agreement. I think it's a wonderful idea." I leaned back in my chair, the old leather groaning softly. "I'm so glad you brought up the agreement, Ben," I said, my voice dropping a little, becoming quieter, heavier. "I think it's a wonderful idea. I have it right here in front of me. I assume you do as well." A confused silence came back over the line. We signed it months ago," Ben stammered. I don't have it on hand. Of course he didn't. I remembered that day perfectly. I had come to their trendy loft apartment with David. Chloe and Ben were so excited, so focused on the final number at the bottom of the page that their pens barely touched the paper before they were talking about guest lists and photographers. They treated the pages of carefully constructed legal language like they were just annoying terms and conditions on a software update. They had clicked agree without reading. "That's a shame," I said, my voice smooth with a politeness that was sharper than any insult. "Because a good engineer always reads the manual. Allow me to refresh your memory. I'm looking at Clause 12b. It's titled Investor Respect and Inclusion. It's a fascinating bit of legal prose. Would you like me to read it to you?" He didn't answer, but I could hear Chloe in the background, a high, thin whisper. What is he talking about? I didn't wait for his permission. I began to read slowly, letting each word land with its full intended weight. "The primary investor, Frank Miller, shall be treated as a guest of honor at all functions, celebrations, and events related to this investment. This includes, but is not limited to, a formal invitation, premium seating, and respectful inclusion." I paused, letting that phrase sink in. "Respectful inclusion," I repeated. "Now, Ben, Chloe, are you still on the line?" "Yes," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good," I continued. "Because here's the important part. Any action, communication, or omission that deliberately excludes or disrespects the primary investor shall be considered a material breach of this agreement." I paused again. "A material breach. That's a legal term, Ben. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It has consequences." The silence on the other end of the phone was no longer confused. It was heavy. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. The sound of two people realizing the floor they were standing on wasn't solid after all. "Now, Chloe," I said, my voice still perfectly even, "I also have a copy of an email I received from you yesterday. The timestamp says 2:14 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Would you like me to read you what you wrote?" "Dad, no," she started, her voice breaking. "I think we should," I said. "For the sake of clarity. It says, don't worry if you want to be a part of it. You can watch through the Google Earth window, LOL. We'll send you the coordinates." I let her own words hang in the air between us. The LOL seemed to echo in the dead silence. "Chloe," I asked, my voice as calm as a surgeon's, "as a point of legal inquiry, do you believe that telling your primary investor, your guest of honor, to watch the event he is paying for on a satellite map constitutes respectful inclusion?" There was no answer. Nothing. Not a breath, not a shuffle of the phone. Just a dead, perfect, and absolute void. It was the beautiful, terrible silence of a perfectly designed circuit finally closing. I could picture them in that sunlit Parisian apartment, the color draining from their faces. Ben, the slick entrepreneur, finally face to face with a risk he couldn't mitigate. Chloe, the influencer, her entire brand, her perfect wedding, her whole curated identity suddenly turning to digital ash. The chateau, the flowers, the band, the custom-made dress, all of it, every last piece of their fantasy was held in an escrow account that I, the man they invited to watch from space, controlled utterly. They hadn't just been disrespectful. They had been stupid. And in the world of contracts and engineering, stupidity is the most expensive mistake you can make. I remembered that day perfectly. I had come to their trendy loft apartment with David. Chloe and Ben were so excited, so focused on the final number at the bottom of the page, that their pens barely touched the paper before they were talking about guest lists and photographers. They treated the pages of carefully constructed legal language like they were just annoying terms and conditions on a software update. They hadn't been signing a contract. They had been signing a fantasy. They never once stopped to read the fine print. And now through the phone I could feel that fantasy crumbling. I could picture the scene in that chic Parisian apartment. The color draining from Ben's face. Chloe sinking into a chair, the full weight of their arrogance crashing down on her. The chateau, the five-star caterer, the celebrity photographer, the custom-made dress. Their entire house of cards built on my sacrifice and their ambition was collapsing in a dead-silent transatlantic phone call. Their perfect content opportunity was about to become a masterclass in consequences. They had wanted to treat this like a business, and now they were trapped in the cold, hard mechanics of one. They had wanted to remove the father from the equation, and they had succeeded. They were now dealing with the investor, an investor they had tried to cheat. The silence finally broke. "What do you want?" Ben finally choked out, the arrogance gone replaced by the thin, desperate voice of a man who knows he is lost. I let the question hang in the air for a moment, letting them both sit with the full, crushing weight of their mistake. I wasn't going to rush this. They had dismissed my entire life with a joke. They could wait a few seconds for my terms. "It's not about what I want, Ben," I said, my voice still as calm as the surface of a still lake. "It's about what the contract requires. You see, when you enter into a business agreement, you agree to a certain code of conduct. You've broken that code. So now we're going to fix it." "Fix it how?" Chloe whispered. "Dad, the wedding is in 3 days. The guests are flying in. What are we supposed to do?" Her panic was a distant signal from a ship I was no longer responsible for saving. "That sounds like a logistical problem," I said. "And I've always been good with logistics. Here's the plan. I will be flying to Paris on Friday. I have a business meeting to attend. I will be meeting with Genevieve to discuss the future of my investment and to restructure the event to bring it back into compliance with our agreement. You two are welcome to attend. In fact, I insist on it." The full, devastating meaning of my words landed on them. I was no longer a distant, forgotten father. I was the client. I was the man in charge. They had uninvited me from their wedding. Now I was summoning them to a meeting about an event that was no longer theirs to control. They had tried to put me on the outside looking in. They had no idea I was about to take my seat at the head of the table. Flying into Charles de Gaulle Airport is a strange experience for a man who has spent most of his life measuring the world in millimeters and voltage. The scale of it, the sheer sprawling indifference of it, should make you feel small. But as I stepped out of the terminal into the cool, damp Parisian air, I didn't feel small at all. I felt like I was finally the right size. I hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address, my voice steady, betraying none of the turbulence that had carried me here. The city unspooled outside the car window, a beautiful, chaotic symphony of gray stone, wrought iron, and impossibly brave drivers. I wasn't a tourist gawking at the sights. I was a man on a mission, and this city wasn't a destination. It was a boardroom. We pulled up to the Four Seasons George V. The entrance was an understated declaration of wealth and history. As the doorman opened my door, I felt the full, delicious irony of the moment. This was the kind of place Chloe and Ben dreamed of, the kind of backdrop they wanted for their carefully curated lives. They saw it as a prize to be won. I saw it as a tool to be used. I had booked a suite with a view of the Eiffel Tower, not for the romance of it, but for the strategy. When you are negotiating, you choose the ground. And I was choosing the highest ground I could find. The suite was magnificent. Cream-colored walls furniture that looked like it had been passed down through generations of quiet money, and a balcony that opened up to the heart of the city. I walked to the window and looked out. There it was. Paris. The city of light. The city I was supposed to see with Susan. A wave of grief, sharp and familiar, washed over me. I had imagined this moment so differently. I had imagined her hand in mine, her head on my shoulder, her laughter as we tried to decipher a French menu. We were supposed to grow old together here in this city. Instead, I was here alone, not to celebrate a life of love, but to clean up the mess left by a love that had lost its way. "Well, Susan," I whispered to the empty room, "we made it. Not the way we planned, but we're here." It wasn't a sad thought. It was a statement of purpose. I was here to honor her too. By refusing to let the legacy we built be squandered on vanity and ingratitude. By turning this ugly betrayal into something that, in its own strange way, had integrity. I didn't waste time admiring the view. I picked up the hotel phone and dialed Genevieve's number. She answered on the first ring, her voice still tight with anxiety. "Genevieve, it's Frank Miller," I said. "I've just checked into my hotel. I'd like to meet with you as soon as possible to discuss the path forward." "Of course, Monsieur Miller. Where are you?" "I'm at the George V," I said. "I've taken the liberty of booking a conference room for tomorrow at 2 p.m. I trust that will be enough time to restructure the event." There was a pause on her end, a beat of stunned silence. I had not just flown to Paris. I had established a base of operations in the heart of the world she aspired to. "That will be perfect, monsieur," she finally said. "Good," I replied. "I've also informed my daughter and her fiancé that they are to attend. Please extend them a formal invitation on my behalf. I want everything to be handled with the utmost professionalism." I hung up the phone and stood on the balcony, the Paris air cool on my face. The city lights were just beginning to flicker on a million tiny promises in the twilight. Chloe and Ben thought they were coming to a fight. They had no idea they were coming to a board meeting where their positions had already been made redundant. I met Genevieve in a quiet corner of the hotel bar an hour later. She was a small chic woman in her 40s, with dark, intelligent eyes that were currently clouded with worry. She looked like a person who was excellent at her job, but hated dealing with the messy emotions of the people who paid for it. She clutched a leather portfolio to her chest like a shield. "Monsieur Miller," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Thank you for meeting me. This situation, it is very delicate." "Please call me Frank," I said, gesturing to the chair opposite me. "And you're right. It is delicate. Which is why we are going to handle it with precision, not panic." I ordered 2 coffees and waited for the server to leave before I continued. "Genevieve." I began my tone calm and professional. "I want to be very clear about one thing. I am not here to cancel the wedding. I am here to save it." She looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Save it." "My investment was intended to fund a beautiful, memorable event," I said. "And it will. But the event as it was structured no longer aligns with the values of the primary investor. That's me. My daughter and her fiancé have misunderstood the nature of our business relationship. They mistook my investment for a blank check with no oversight. That was an error. I let that sink in. I wasn't attacking Chloe. I was framing the problem in a language Genevieve understood: business, professionalism, contracts. "I have reviewed the agreement," I continued, "and my daughter has committed a material breach. Legally, I have every right to pull all funding and walk away. But I won't do that. I won't do that to you, and I won't do that to the vendors you've hired in good faith." The relief that washed over her face was profound. She visibly relaxed her shoulders, dropping an inch. "So, what happens now?" she asked. "Now," I said, leaning forward slightly, "we restructure. The wedding will proceed. The chateau will be paid. Your company will be paid. But the event will be adjusted to come back into compliance with the contract. Tomorrow at our meeting, I will present a revised plan. I will need your support as my partner in executing it." I had just elevated her from a hired planner, caught in a family dispute, to my strategic partner. I was giving her a path forward that protected her business and her reputation. I wasn't the angry father. I was the reasonable, powerful client offering a solution. "Yes," she said, nodding, her voice firm now. "Yes, of course, Frank. You will have my full support." I smiled. The first domino had just fallen exactly as planned. The conference room I'd booked was a study in quiet power. The table was a single massive piece of polished mahogany. A pitcher of ice water sat in the center, its surface perfectly still. Through the tall windows, the Parisian sky was a soft, forgiving gray. Genevieve sat to my right, her portfolio open, a pen resting beside her fingers. We were a team. We were the board of directors. Chloe and Ben arrived at 2 o'clock on the dot. They didn't look like the confident, glamorous couple from the pitch meeting. They looked like they had been awake all night arguing their way through a maze of their own making. Ben's suit was sharp, but his shoulders were slumped. Chloe wore a simple black dress, and her eyes, usually bright with ambition, were shadowed with a mixture of fury and exhaustion. They didn't look like a bride and groom. They looked like defendants. They took the seats opposite us. The expanse of mahogany between us felt like a courtroom. "Thank you for coming." I began, my voice even measured. I was not a father scolding his children. I was a chairman calling a meeting to order. "We're here today to address the material breach of the investment agreement dated June 12th and to outline the corrective actions required to bring the event back into compliance." Ben flinched at the phrase corrective actions. Chloe just stared at me, her jaw tight. I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a revised event summary. Given the circumstances, I said the event's original mission as a brand launching vehicle is no longer viable. Therefore, we will be restructuring it. The new theme will be a celebration of family in memory of Susan Miller. Chloe's breath hitched. "In memory of Mom, yes," I said. "It seems more appropriate. As such, the decor will be adjusted. The vibrant, brand-focused color scheme will be replaced with a more classic and elegant palette of white and gold. The primary floral arrangements will be white lilies. They were your mother's favorite." "I'm surprised you don't remember." She said nothing. The small personal detail was a sharper cut than any legal term. Next, I continued the guest list. Since this is now a family-focused event, the invitees must reflect that. I will be extending formal invitations to my sister, your Aunt Carol, and my lawyer and lifelong friend David Chen and his wife. I will be flying them to Paris at my own expense. The block of rooms reserved for your brand associates and influencer friends will be significantly curated. We will need a revised list from you by 5 p.m. today. Genevieve and I will make the final approvals. Ben started to speak, but I held up a hand. Finally, the ceremony itself. The schedule will be adjusted to include a brief tribute. I will be giving a speech as the host of the event to share a few memories of your mother and to offer my blessings. That was the final blow. I had just removed them from the center of their own universe. I had taken their stage, their spotlight, their narrative, and replaced it with my own. A story of love and memory, not of hashtags and ambition. "You can't do this," Chloe finally whispered, her voice trembling. "This is our wedding. It's my day." "The contract disagrees," I said, my voice gentle but unyielding. "The contract gives me the right to pause all funding in the event of a breach. I am not canceling the event, Chloe. I am offering a path forward that brings it back into compliance with the values of the investment. These are the terms. They are not negotiable. The wedding will proceed as a tribute to your mother with our family present." I leaned back in my chair. "You and Ben are of course still the bride and groom. You are welcome to attend. Your presence is in fact requested." The full, devastating weight of it finally landed. They could have their wedding, but it would not be their wedding. It would be mine. They would be guests at a party they no longer controlled, a performance where they were no longer the stars. Their dream of a perfect Instagrammable wedding had just been rewritten line by the father they had tried to erase. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of my pronouncements settle in the quiet, elegant room. The faces of my daughter and her fiancé were a study in disbelief. They had walked in here expecting to negotiate, perhaps even to intimidate me. They were now learning that the meeting was not a negotiation at all. It was a debriefing. You and Ben are, of course, still the bride and groom, I said, my voice maintaining its steady, even tone. You are welcome to attend. Your presence is in fact requested. But let me be perfectly clear. This is no longer your show. It is a family gathering to honor the memory of your mother, funded by the legacy she and I built together. That was the moment Chloe finally broke. The mask of practiced composure shattered, and raw, unfiltered entitlement poured out. She shot to her feet, her hands clenched into fists on the polished mahogany. "No!" she cried, her voice high and sharp. "You can't do this. You can't just take it away from me. This is my wedding. It's my day. I planned this for a year. The colors, the theme, my vision. It's for my brand, for my future. You are ruining everything. Everything." She was breathing hard, her eyes flashing with a fury that was both childish and absolute. Ben just sat there, pale and silent, a spectator to his own unraveling. Genevieve looked down at her notepad, a model of professional discretion. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her anger. I simply met her furious gaze with a calm I hadn't felt in years. "You are mistaken, Chloe," I said, and the quiet of my voice seemed to suck the air out of her rage. "You didn't have your day taken from you. You gave it away. You gave it away when you decided that my contribution, my presence, and my love were worth less than a joke in an email. You gave it away when you typed the letters LOL. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. My authority in the room was now absolute. So now you have a choice. You can attend this celebration with the grace and respect your mother deserves. Or you can choose not to come. The party will happen regardless. The funds will be spent honoring Susan's memory with or without you. The choice is yours." I turned and walked toward the door, leaving them sitting in the stunning, silent wreckage of their own design. The only question left was whether their pride was more important than the last shred of their dignity. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky so impossibly blue it looked like it had been painted for a movie. A crisp autumn breeze rustled the ancient trees surrounding the chateau, sending a cascade of gold and crimson leaves across the manicured lawns. The air smelled of damp earth, old stone, and the faint, sweet perfume of thousands of white lilies. Genevieve had worked a miracle. The venue was breathtaking, not in the loud, ostentatious way Chloe had planned, but in a classic, understated style that spoke of quiet money and deep history. It was elegant. It was beautiful. It was a perfect tribute to Susan. I stood on the grand terrace, a glass of champagne in my hand, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. My sister Carol was beside me, her eyes a little misty. "Susan would have loved this, Frank," she whispered, squeezing my arm. My old friend David was laughing with his wife, his booming voice echoing slightly in the vast open space. This was what a family gathering was supposed to feel like. Real, warm, uncomplicated. For the first time, I wasn't just a father or an investor. I was the host. I was the patriarch standing in the heart of an event I had reshaped to reflect something true. Then I saw them. Chloe and Ben were standing near the ornate fountain, a perfect picture of a bride and groom. Her dress was magnificent, a cloud of white silk. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, but their smiles were brittle. Their movements were stiff and uncertain. They were like beautiful mannequins placed in a diorama of a life that was no longer theirs. They went through the motions, greeting the few influencer friends who hadn't canceled, but the energy was gone. The effortless glamour they projected online was absent in person, replaced by a tense, watchful anxiety. Their friends looked just as lost. They held their phones but seemed unsure of what to post. How do you caption this? A wedding that was supposed to be a viral sensation had become a quiet, personal affair. The brand had been replaced by a family. The content opportunity had been replaced by genuine emotion. They were aliens at a foreign ceremony, and they knew it. I walked over to my daughter. She saw me approaching, and her smile tightened. Ben just stared at a point over my shoulder. I didn't mention the contract, the meeting, or the email. I just looked at her, the little girl I had once held in my arms, now a woman standing on the edge of a life she had almost broken. "You look beautiful, Chloe," I said, and I meant it. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, and the words were so small, so fragile, they were almost carried away by the breeze. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a resolution. But it was a start. I nodded once and walked away, leaving them in their gilded cage. Later, as we all took our seats for the reception dinner, the soft glow of candlelight illuminating the room, I saw them at the head table, isolated in their splendor. The clinking of glasses and the happy chatter of my family filled the air. The scene was set. The audience was waiting. And I knew, as I looked at the daughter who had tried to cast me out, that the most important part of the day was yet to come. The dessert plates had been cleared, and the soft golden light of the chandeliers bathed the room in a warm glow. A gentle hum of conversation filled the air, the sound of family and friends content and at ease. Someone, my sister Carol, I think, gently tapped her water glass with a spoon. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to me. I pushed my chair back and stood up, my hands resting lightly on the table. I looked around at the faces of the people I loved. My sister, my oldest friends, my niece and nephew. And then at the head table I looked at my daughter. For a moment she was just Chloe, the little girl with scraped knees and a fierce love for stray cats. Then the moment passed, and she was the woman who had sent the email. I picked up my champagne glass. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice clear and steady. "Thank you all for being here. It means more to me than I can say, to have you with us in this beautiful place." I paused and took a slow breath. Many of you know how much this city meant to my late wife, Susan. For years we had a dream. We had a file in our desk drawer labeled Paris Fund. Inside were pictures she'd cut from travel magazines, brochures for museums, and a map of the city with little circles drawn around cafes she wanted to try. She used to say that on our 40th anniversary, we would finally come here, find a little bistro, and order the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu, just because we could. I smiled a real smile, though it was tinged with the familiar ache of her absence. We never got to take that trip. Life, as it often does, had other plans. But I know if she were here tonight, she would be looking around this room at all of you, and her heart would be full. She believed that the best things in life weren't things you owned, but moments you shared. She believed that a life's true value was measured by the love you give away. I turned my gaze toward the head table. Chloe was watching me, her expression unreadable. Ben was staring down at his plate. And I want to thank Chloe and Ben for this opportunity, I said, letting the word hang in the air, heavy with a meaning only the three of us understood. This event, this gathering, has given me a chance to think very deeply about what legacy truly means. It's not about buildings or bank accounts. It's about the impact we leave on the world. It's about creating opportunities for others, just as Susan and I were so fortunate to have. I raised my glass a little higher. Susan was a passionate supporter of the arts. She believed that a young person with a creative spark deserved a chance to set the world on fire. She would volunteer at the local art college, and she always said that the talent she saw there was breathtaking, held back only by a lack of resources. I took one final breath, the culmination of weeks of planning, of a lifetime of love, and a final painful lesson. And so, in honor of her generous spirit, and to create a legacy that truly reflects the woman she was, I am announcing tonight that the entire remaining balance of my investment in this event, along with a matching personal contribution from my own funds, will be used to establish the Susan Miller Scholarship Fund for young art students at the Cleveland Institute of Art. For a second, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the soft sigh of the chandeliers. Then my old friend David started to clap. Slowly at first, then with resounding force. My sister Carol stood up, her face wet with tears, her applause fierce. Soon the entire room was on its feet, the sound of their clapping echoing through the grand hall. It was a wave of genuine, heartfelt approval, and through it all I watched Chloe and Ben. They were frozen. They had to smile. They had to clap. They were trapped, forced to be the public faces of a beautiful, generous act that had been born from their own cruelty. Their dream wedding had just been transformed in front of everyone they knew into a memorial for the mother Chloe had forgotten and a charitable foundation they had no part in. Their influencer friends looked utterly baffled. This wasn't content. This was character, and it had nothing to do with them. Their perfect day, their brand launching event, had been irrevocably and beautifully hijacked. They hadn't just lost control. They had been rendered completely and publicly irrelevant. I looked at my daughter, and for a fleeting moment I saw the little girl who believed in magic. Then I looked at the man beside her, who believed only in leverage. I raised my glass. Susan was a passionate supporter of the arts. I said, my voice resonating with a warmth and sincerity that filled the grand hall. She believed that a young person with a creative spark deserved a chance to set the world on fire. She always said that the greatest act of love was to provide the fuel for someone else's dream. I paused, letting my gaze drift over the guests and then back to the head table. And so, in honor of her generous spirit and to create a legacy that truly reflects the woman she was, I am announcing tonight that the entire remaining balance of my investment in this event, along with a matching personal contribution from my own funds, will be used to establish the Susan Miller Scholarship Fund for young art students at the Cleveland Institute of Art. For a second, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the soft sigh of the chandeliers. Then my old friend David started to clap. Slowly at first, then with resounding force. My sister Carol stood up, her face wet with tears, her applause fierce. Soon the entire room was on its feet, the sound of their clapping echoing through the chateau. It was a wave of genuine, heartfelt approval, and through it all I watched Chloe and Ben. They were frozen. They had to smile. They had to clap. They were trapped, forced to be the public faces of a beautiful, generous act that had been born from their own cruelty. Their dream wedding had just been transformed in front of everyone they knew into a memorial for the mother Chloe had forgotten and a charitable foundation they had no part in. Their influencer friends looked utterly baffled. This wasn't content. This was character, and it had nothing to do with them. Their perfect day, their brand launching event had been irrevocably and beautifully hijacked. They sat there smiling, their brittle smiles clapping with hands that must have felt like stone. They hadn't just lost control of the party. They had been rendered completely and publicly irrelevant. They were no longer the stars of the show. They were just two people in expensive clothes applauding the final undeniable proof that they had lost. The applause eventually faded, replaced by the soft clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation. But the energy in the room had changed. The story was no longer about a wedding. It was about a legacy. I didn't stay for the cake. I said my goodbyes to my family, gave my sister a long hug, and quietly slipped out of the chateau. The Parisian night was cool and clean. As the taxi carried me back through the city, I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I just felt quiet. The fight was over. The call came 2 days later. I was sitting on my hotel balcony, a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the city wake up. The caller ID said, "Chloe." I let it ring for a moment, then answered. "Dad." Her voice was small, fragile. Nothing like the confident, brittle tone she had used for years. It was the voice of a little girl again. "I'm here, Chloe," I said. There was a long pause filled with the sound of her shaky breath. I'm sorry," she whispered, and then the words came in a rush, stumbling over sobs. "I'm so sorry, Dad. For everything. For the email. For how I've been. I was so selfish and so ugly." I saw the video from the wedding, the speech you gave about Mom. I didn't realize. I forgot. She was crying freely now, the sound raw and unfiltered. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession. I listened, letting her empty all the poison she had carried for so long. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said finally, her voice thick with tears. I wanted you to know that I know. I know what I did. I looked out at the Eiffel Tower, its iron lattice stark against the morning sky. This was the moment. The crossroads. I could have been gracious. I could have said, "It's okay, I forgive you." But that would have been a lie. Forgiveness isn't a switch you can flip. It's a bridge you have to build, plank by painful plank. An apology is a starting point, Chloe. I said, my voice gentle but firm. Not a finish line. What you did, it broke something that took a lifetime to build. Rebuilding it will take a very long time. I know, she whispered. I'll wait. I'll do the work. Good, I said. That's all I can ask. After the call, I didn't feel a sense of closure. I felt a sense of space. A door that had been sealed shut for years had just been cracked open a tiny bit. I stood up and looked around the beautiful hotel suite. My flight back to Cleveland was scheduled for the next day. But as I looked out at the city Susan and I had dreamed of, a new thought began to form. I wasn't going home. Not yet. I had come to Paris to correct a contract. I had come to salvage an investment. But I had not yet come here for Susan. I had not yet come here for myself. I picked up the phone and called the front desk to extend my stay. Then I called my friend David and asked him to handle the sale of my house in Cleveland. I called my sister and told her my plans. I was staying in Paris, not on Chloe's dime, not on the investment money. On my own. For the first time, I was going to use the money I had worked my entire life for to live out a dream that belonged to me. I was going to sit at the cafes Susan had circled on the map. I was going to visit the museums whose brochures she had saved. I was going to finally drink that expensive bottle of wine in her honor. I was going to live. The next few weeks were a quiet revelation. I walked the city not as a tourist, but as a pilgrim. I found a small apartment to rent in Le Marais with a window that overlooked a bustling street. I learned a few clumsy phrases in French. I found a favorite bakery, a favorite bench in the Luxembourg Gardens. Life slowed down. The urgent, angry hum that had been my companion for years faded, replaced by the gentle, steady rhythm of a city that has seen everything and is in no particular hurry. The final scene found me a month later sitting at a small round table outside a café on the Rue Claire. The autumn sun was warm on my face. In my hands, I held a long, handwritten letter from Chloe. It was her third one. Each one was a small, hesitant step on that long bridge back to each other. My phone buzzed on the table. I glanced down. It was her calling again. I looked at her name on the screen, then I looked up at the vibrant, beautiful Parisian street, at the people laughing at the life happening all around me. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. I silenced the call and put the phone face down. I wasn't ignoring her out of spite. I was choosing my own peace. I was, as I had promised myself, finally too busy to pick up. I was too busy living. This story teaches that true family respect isn't purchased with endless generosity. When kindness is treated as weakness, setting firm boundaries. Isn't revenge, it's a crucial act of self-preservation. It's never too late to reclaim your own narrative and live with the dignity you have always deserved. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments below. For more stories like this, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.